Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are continuing our series about the Genealogical Proof Standard. We did an introduction, we covered the first three steps in the Genealogical Proof Standard, and today we'll be talking about the fourth, which is resolution of conflicting evidence. I'll tell you, share some information about why that's important, and then walk through some steps about how to do that at a really basic level, and then I'll give you an example from my own family history about why this step is so important and how I was able to resolve some seemingly innocuous conflicting evidence that ended up being a really big deal. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let me just remind those of you who may have not caught the first few episodes in this series, you can go back and watch them on our YouTube channel. I would encourage you to do so. All of the information about the Genealogical Proof Standard comes from the Board for Certification of Genealogists. They have the Genealogical Proof Standard posted on their website. They also have published a manual called Genealogy Standards. It's just not a large but it's very, very useful reference guide. I keep a copy of it on my desk. It's starting to get very dog-eared. I would encourage you to purchase a copy of that. If you're serious about making sure that your family history information is accurate and that you're climbing your own tree and not somebody else's. Here's a review of the steps included in the Genealogical Proof Standard. We've talked already about a reasonably exhaustive search, complete and accurate citation of sources, analysis and correlation of the collected information. Today we're going to be talking about resolution of conflicting evidence, and then next month we'll wrap it up with a soundly reasoned, coherently written conclusion. So let's talk about resolution of conflicting evidence. Off of the website, for the BCG website, you're going to see this explanation. The purpose of this step is that it substantiates the conclusion's credibility. Basically what that means is that it allows you to say that this is proof, that the information you've collected is proof about a specific person's name, or maybe a date, or a location, or a relationship. And those are all individual pieces of information that we're collecting about people. And each one of them requires some kind of proof or us to come to a conclusion that is credible based on the evidence that we've collected. If conflicting evidence is not resolved, then a credible conclusion is not possible. That means that you can put whatever you want in your tree, but it might not be accurate. And I've said this before, and I actually end every show with the tagline, "Have fun climbing your family tree." And sometimes I put an emphasis on that word "your," because one of the things that we've discovered is, well, and I've been guilty of this myself, sometimes we get so excited about adding information to our tree that we fail to walk through the steps of the Genealogical Proof Standard, and we end up climbing someone else's tree. I once added have about 400 people in my tree that are not actually even part of my family because I failed to prove a relationship between a father and son, grabbed the wrong parents, and then kept climbing that tree, disconnecting that relationship, and hence that whole branch of tree research that I had done was really painful. So this just ensures that we are learning about our own ancestors and about our own families. Okay, so let's talk about how we're going to do this. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to identify what the conflicting items are. Now, at this point in the Genealogical Proof Standard, in your research process, you've already completed a reasonably exhaustive search. That means you have collected all the information you can find about a given person or family. You've collected census records and birth, marriage, and death records, military records and land records. You've collected information about the children and newspaper articles and tombstone photo, whatever you can find. You have conducted what we call a reasonably exhaustive search. You've created source citations as you've gone through that process. You've analyzed and correlated the information you've collected. And now what you're doing as part of this process is you're identifying which pieces of information conflict. Specifically, there's going to be these kinds of things that you're going to look for. Is the name consistent or inconsistent? Are the ages or birth dates consistent or inconsistent? What about other dates? Maybe a marriage date or a death date. Are those consistent or inconsistent in the records that you found? Locations, do they change? Okay, we'll have to explain why. You have to resolve that conflicting evidence. And relationships. Sometimes relationships are explicitly stated. For example, in a probate record, it might explicitly state, I, John Smith, leave to my children, and then list the names of the children. And maybe the name of the child you're looking for is not on that list, but you found that child listed somewhere else as a son of John Smith. So now you have two conflicting pieces of information. One that says this person is a child of John Smith, and then one that says I, John Smith, leave to my children, and doesn't list the name of that child. Okay, that's an example of conflicting evidence. And so you have to be able to identify what that conflicting evidence is. You cannot just dismiss it out of hand. You cannot just say, oh, well, that doesn't support the conclusion I've already drawn, or the idea already in my head, or the family story that's been told, and just ignore the evidence. Okay, you have to identify it. The next step in this process then, or the next way to resolve conflicting evidence, is that you need to be able to provide a rational explanation for believing one piece of evidence over another piece of evidence. Okay, and there are some very specific ways to do this. One is consider who was providing the information and why the information was being provided. Okay, so for example, on a census record, with the exception of the 1940 census, we have no idea who provided the information to the census taker. That means it is less credible than possibly other pieces of evidence you've collected. Doesn't mean we dismiss it out of hand, but it does mean that we don't know who the informant was. The informant on a census could have been the head of household, it could have been the mother in the family, it could have been the 13-year-old daughter, it could have been the next door neighbor who lived down the way and was only vaguely acquainted with this family. Okay, so we have to consider who provided the information. There are, in many cases, informants listed, like on a death certificate, for example. It lists the informant. Consider who that person is. What's the relationship of that person to the deceased? How much would they know or not know about the deceased's birth date and place, or parents, or mother's maiden name? Okay, military paperwork, pension files. I mean, there's so many records that we use. You have to think about who it is providing the information, and also why the information was being provided. If somebody is joining the military and all of a sudden their age is 2 years older, well, you know why that information is being provided. They're providing their birth date so that they can join the military. And if that conflicts with every other piece of information you have about their birth date being 2 years later, well, that's a pretty good, quick, easy way to resolve that piece of conflicting evidence. They were lying about their age in order to join the military. Okay, but you have to be able to compare all the pieces of evidence and give a rational explanation for believing one piece of evidence over another. Okay. And this comes straight out of the Genealogy Standards Manual. I thought the quote was worth pulling. It says, articulate a defensible rationale for setting aside evidence items that support all but one side of the conflict, which basically is saying the same thing, but I liked the language of it, right? Articulate a defensible rationale. So sometimes that means we have to be able to explain ourselves, and not just in our heads. I find that when I get stuck in my head doing genealogy research, I make mistakes. And so I do a lot of writing. Most of you who've spent any time with me are aware of my system of note-taking in Family Tree Maker, where I transcribe every record that I find and include that in here. I also insert personal notes here, and I'll go over this one in more detail in just a minute, but I use my Family Tree Maker notes to articulate some of these reasons why I'm seeing conflicting evidence and why I have chosen to believe one piece of evidence over another. I do that because I have to get out of my own head, but I also do that because invariably I'm going to come back to that family at another time, in another research session, doing something else, and I'm going to look at what I've put in there for this person's name or their birth date, and then I'm going to look at my notes, and if I haven't included a rational explanation, I'm going to question myself. My memory is not such that I'm going to remember why I chose one date over another 2 years earlier. So write it down. And the notes on a person, and you have that feature on your online tree as well, the notes on a person is one of the best places to do that. You can also leave it as a comment on your online tree. Notes are only visible by people who own the tree or who are assigned as editors to that tree. But comments can be seen by everyone. And so if you want to provide your defensible rationale, if you want to provide your reason for why you selected one date over another or one name over another, why you chose to believe one piece of evidence over another, in the comment section, that's going to increase your credibility, which is great, because then people will look at the research that you spent all this time and energy, and they'll believe it rather than dismissing it out of hand because they notice the conflicting evidence. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about some of the specific kinds of conflicting evidence you're going to come across. One is names. Okay, so for example, here's my surname. It's Cowan, C-O-W-A-N. But I have found records where it's spelled C-O-W-I-N and C-O-W-E-N. That's easily explained, right? That is the kind of conflict that I can jot down to a spelling error, right? Spelling errors, transcription errors, spelling was not important, prior to the days of Social Security. People's names weren't necessarily spelled a consistent way. As a matter of fact, I have a great-grandfather, I think I've shared this before, I have a great-grandfather who on one military document, in his own hand, his name is spelled 2 different ways. Just not that big of a deal, how consistent their name may or may not have been spelled. And so whether it's a spelling error or just an inconsistency in the spelling, that's not that big of a deal. That's easily explainable. However, these last 2 versions are a little more difficult to explain. Cohen, right? I work a lot with Jewish family history, and so people see my last name, Cowan, and they pronounce it Cohen, and invariably somebody's going to hear somebody say my name and they're going to write it down that way. And so I have seen in certain places, even today, my name spelled C-O-H-E-N because somebody made an assumption because of my work in the Jewish genealogy community that I was Jewish, or they heard my name pronounced and thought that was the way that it was spelled. I've even had people question if my name was changed or Americanized from Cohen to Cowan. And the fact of the matter, in my case anyway, is that it wasn't. My family came from Scotland, and so it's always been Cowan as far back as I've been able to trace so far. Another one is Collin, C-O-L-L-I-N. And again, this is a current situation, okay? I have received mail where my name has been written as Crista Cowan. And if I say that fast enough, you're going to understand why, right? Imagine picking up a telephone and ordering something, and somebody asks for your name, and you say, my name is Crista Cowan, and they hear Collin. And so that's what they write down. Rather than asking me to spell it or whatever, they just write down what they hear. Okay, so these are examples from my life. Now imagine, 100, 200 years ago, your ancestors living on the frontier, may or may not be literate. The person who they're talking to may or may not be very literate. And now there's no wonder we end up with all sorts of variance in names. Okay, that's the kind of thing that is easily explainable. And so I keep a list of spelling variations for surnames in my family so that I can explain why this happens, right? But sometimes names are a little bit more difficult to explain. Maybe the name is spelled differently, but maybe they go by different names. Maybe you have collected records for people and they have all different names on them. How do you know those are not different people? How do you know those are the same person? And so you have to start digging into it or explaining, well, in this record they went by their middle name, and then in this record they went by their first name, or they were going by their initials and then their initials got swapped. Okay, I know a lot of my family in the South in particular, it doesn't happen so much with my dad's side of the family in the North, but with my mom's family in the South, very often, particularly on census records, children will go by their middle name until they become an adult, and then they'll go by their first name. And one of the reasons that I have seen that happen is that oftentimes they're named after somebody in the family. And by the time they're an adult, that family member has passed away, and so now they revert to that first name in honor of that family member, as opposed to going by the middle name all growing up so as not to be confused with that family member. So that, again, there's my reasonable explanation for why there might be different names on different records, but I believe these are the same person. Another situation we have sometimes is nicknames, where people have variant nicknames that might not even be a variation of their name. It might be an entirely unrelated nickname. It might have something to do with their occupation or where they live or a physical feature. My grandmother has a girlfriend who, to the day she died, called her Red. Well, that's because my grandmother has bright red hair. And so those nicknames come about for a variety of reasons, but again, you have to be able to give a reasonable explanation why you think this person with this nickname is the same as this person who might have a different name on a particular document. Another conflicting evidence issue we have to resolve is that sometimes people Americanize their names, both given names and surnames, not just surnames. It happens with given names as well. And so there are tools available for us to find common Americanizations of names, where we can say, again, we can explain this person on this passenger list is the same as this person in this census and this death record, even though they have different names, and here's why. Okay, so those are names. Ages and dates. Ages and dates are a little bit trickier, but think about the places where those ages and dates show up, okay? Birth records, you may think, oh, I just hit the wrong key. There we go. Birth records, you might think would be the most accurate, and that's likely true, except that sometimes those birth records are what we call a delayed birth record. Okay, sometimes that person, for example, needed to apply for Social Security or a passport or whatever the circumstances were, and when they were 50 years old, they went to go do that and realized their birth was never registered. They lived in a time and place where it wasn't required by law, or it just didn't happen, and so they then have to get an affidavit from somebody who has known them their whole life and knows when their birthday is, or somebody who was at their birth, and they will file, in some cases, a delayed birth certificate or a delayed birth record, and then they can use that for obtaining their passport or their Social Security card or whatever. So now we're looking at a birth record that's recorded 50 years after the fact. And understanding how, who, and why, and when all of those records were created is part of the process of citing your sources. And now, hopefully, you can start to see why that source citation step is so important, because when we get to this point, we need to be able to not just evaluate the evidence, but resolve some of that conflicting evidence. Okay? Census records we've talked about, not always consistent because of who provided the information. Military service records can be suspect. Again, people sometimes lied intentionally in order to serve, either up-aging themselves if they're too young or down-aging themselves if they're too old and they wanted to serve. Lots of reasons that happens. Death records are not always accurate, particularly when you talk about birth information. Even tombstones I've seen inaccurate. Just because it's carved in stone doesn't make it correct. Okay, so again, a reasonable explanation for why dates on a tombstone might be incorrect. Well, maybe the tombstone wasn't placed at the cemetery when the person died. Maybe it was placed 20 years later when his wife died. And so now 20 years later, we've got somebody trying to remember, well, grandpa was born in this year and he died in this year. And so there's your explanation. That's how you resolve some of that conflicting evidence. Again, it doesn't have to be a big deal. Sometimes it's just a matter of making a little 1 or 2 line note for yourself, again, to remind yourself, oh, I found this, or here's why I chose this piece of evidence over another. Locations are sometimes inconsistent, and so there are a couple of reasons why this happens that you need to consider. One is boundary changes. Okay, we see this a lot in Eastern Europe, but it does happen here in the U.S. as well, where people will say, oh, well, you know, I was born in a particular country, and then the next census it says they were born in a different country, and sometimes even I've seen as many as 3, I think, countries listed on a birth record, or on a census record as a birthplace. And so you think, what on earth is happening, right? Well, it could be that when they were born there, it was called one thing, and when the census taker asked them about it, it was called another thing. And by the time World War I was over, it was called something else. And so now we've got 3 birth locations, which are really all the same birth location. It's just that the boundaries have changed. But in order for you to resolve that conflicting evidence, in order for you to say with certainty, they were really born in this place, and here's why the records all say something different, you have to do a little bit of research. You have to look into the boundary changes and when those boundary changes occurred, and then give a reasonable explanation for why you think it was stated differently on different records. That does happen here in the U.S. as well. Sometimes state boundaries have changed over time. The most notable one in my family, of course, is West Virginia. West Virginia wasn't created until the 1850s, and yet my family lived in the same little spit of land that I get to go visit this weekend. The same little spit of land, they lived there for decades, and yet they lived in a couple different states and several different counties as the boundaries changed around them. And so some of their children report being born in Ohio, and some of their children report being born in Pennsylvania, and some of their children report being born in Virginia, and some in West Virginia, and some of those same children change what they say over the course of time. But because I have done the research to figure out exactly where they lived, I can look and see where and how those boundaries changed over time. The other thing you have to think about with locations is how was the question asked? I use census records as an example often just because they're the records that we deal with probably the most, especially those of you who are new to family history. But think about how the question was asked. The question on the census specifically is, where were you born? But I have a sneaking suspicion that not all census takers asked that question in that way. What they may have said is, where are you from? And I don't know about you, but if somebody asks me where I was born, the answer to that question is very different than where are you from. Okay? And so if somebody asked me that question and I responded, it might look like I was lying or confused or whatever, because one would be one state and one would be another. So think about that. You also have to think about the prejudices of the time. Our ancestors, lived in times just like we do, where there are prejudices and biases against certain groups of people, and you have to think about that. My great-grandmother, she was actually born in Texas. She was born in Dallas, Texas, but she was raised in a German community. Her parents were both German immigrants. German was her first language. It was the language they spoke in the home. She went to a German school. She went to a German church. And so it wasn't until she was a teenager almost that she really assimilated into American culture. So she was raised with this very German identity. And then she met my great-grandfather. He was in the U.S. Army at the time, stationed in Texas. And they got married, and then he had to go back back to service. And then shortly after that, he was shipped off to Europe for World War I. And so they wrote letters. They wrote beautiful, beautiful letters to each other. And I have these letters, and I've transcribed them all and shared them with the family, and my great-grandparents would probably be mortified that I've done that because they're mushy and wonderful. But one of the things that I noticed in these letters And I knew this great-grandmother. One of the things I noticed in these letters was that he called her his little Dutch girl. It wasn't his little Deutsch girl, right? Deutsch, of course, being the German word for German, right? He called her his little Dutch girl. And he did that intentionally because there was a lot of prejudices against the Germans at the time. He was stationed in Europe during World War I. He was an officer in the army, and mail was screened. And so people were reading his mail, and if he had made references to her as his little German girl or as his little Deutsch girl, that might have caused some conflicts for him, and maybe for her, who knows. And so he called her his little Dutch girl. And so that could easily be picked up 100 years from now by some of my own descendants, and they could say, oh, Grandma Cowan must have been Dutch, right? And all of a sudden there's this family story that she's Dutch and that she must be from a specific place because of that, when the fact of the matter is she was born in Texas to German parents. So think about or learn about the prejudices of the time, what was going on in the world, why might someone not want to identify as German, or not want to identify as Native American, or not want to identify as Polish, or whatever the circumstance, might not want to identify as Irish. Okay, think about what the prejudices of the time were, again, to help explain why you might see conflicting pieces of evidence when it comes to the locations in their lives. Let's then talk about relationships. Relationships are probably one of the trickier things in family history to identify and to connect with, and yet it is the family history, right? How we connect people. And so here are just some things to consider when you're resolving conflicting evidence. The first one is labels that we give to relationships now have not always meant the same thing historically. Here are some examples. Just because someone is listed as senior or junior on a record does not mean that that person has a father or a son who has the exact same name, okay? There are very, very often times where on a record someone is called senior and someone else is called junior, sometimes even on the same page, not because they have a familial relationship, but because that is the way that the tax collector or the land surveyor or the census taker decided to, or the way that the community decided to differentiate between two men with the same name in the same community. Okay? Sometimes they are father and son. Sometimes they're nephew and uncle or grandfather and grandson, and sometimes there is no familial relationship at all. So just because they're labeled as senior or junior doesn't mean that's a father-son relationship. Okay? So just be aware of that so that you, again, if you find somebody listed as a junior and you put his father in with the same name, and then you can't find a father with that name, or you find a conflicting piece of evidence that states that his father's name was something else, it could just be because you've fallen into that trap. An in-law does not always mean what we think it means. For example, a son-in-law today typically means someone who has married your daughter. But in-law is just a term that means that the law is involved in this relationship. Okay, in the case of marriage, there is marriage laws, and that's why we call them a son-in-law. But historically, a son-in-law could also be an adopted son. Again, the law was involved in this relationship between these parents and this child, and so he is now a son-in-law. The word cousin, the word nephew, aunts and uncles, all of those sometimes are used as very loose relationships. And so don't assume that just because somebody's listed as a cousin that means that this person is the son of, the aunt or uncle, okay? Sometimes you have to be a little bit more creative in looking at those relationships. Also take into consideration who was providing the information. That's really important. Very often I have this sneaking suspicion that it's the woman of the household that is providing the information to the census taker when I see that the head of household is listed as head and she's listed as wife, and 3 children are all listed as children, and then her mother or his mother is listed as, mother, or instead of mother-in-law or whatever, right? Sometimes those relationships get a little confusing because sometimes the census taker wrote it down based on the relationship to the person providing the information, not the head of household, again, which was the instructions. So, one of the other things I do to sometimes sort out relationships is create a family timeline. Sometimes a child might be not listed on a probate record or a will because they had already passed away. So it's not because they're not really a child in that family, it's because they predeceased the father. So start to think about the family structure in a timeline manner. Okay, let's wrap up with this simple example from my family history. This is some information straight out of census records. I've tried to keep it really basic, which is hard to do because the contextual information helps solve the problem. But here I've got a woman, and it's from these census records listed with the same husband. The husband's information is consistent, mostly consistent on every record. The children that come in and leave the household overlap over censuses. So I know I've got the right family. The family moves in between 1910 and 1920. I think they moved to Missouri or maybe Arkansas. Anyway, the family moves here in between these two censuses, but I've got this right family, okay? And yet this information about the mother or the wife in this household is inconsistent. Her name's listed as Mary E. in 2 censuses, Eliza in 1, and Elizabeth in another. Her age is listed as 19. 35, 46, and 49 successively. And then her birthplace is listed as Ohio, Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania, Ohio. Now, some beginners to family history might be really tempted to just skip right over this and just say her name is Mary Elizabeth, and so that takes care of the name. And she was 19 in 1880, and she had, she just gotten married the year before, and she had a brand new baby, and so that's probably the most accurate. She probably just lied about her age as she got older. And they're living in Ohio, and she said she was born in Ohio, but then she says Pennsylvania. So she probably was born in Pennsylvania because they were living in Ohio, and maybe she just misunderstood the question. Okay, that is exactly what a lot of people new to family history do when trying to resolve conflicting evidence in their mind. However, sometimes we have to look a little bit closer. What are the possible reasons for the discrepancy in the information? Are we comparing enough records to make sure that we've got the whole story? 4 census records is not the whole story about this family. And then could this possibly be multiple people? Now, of course, the family story says that Grandpa George was only married once. And so why would that even occur to me? Well, it occurs to me because there's some really odd information here. It's not wildly conflicting, but it's enough to make me pause and want to do more research and want to understand more what's happening with this family. So let me just give you the quick answer. There are actually 2 women represented here. Mary E. Was actually born in 1861, and she was born in Ohio, and she was the first wife, and she had a couple of children, and then she passed away. I was able to discover that because I looked up her children's death certificate, and it listed her maiden name, and the maiden name matched the maiden name that I had found on the marriage record in 1878. Now, the only reason I was finally clued in that that this is a second woman is because the the death certificates of the younger children listed a mother with a different maiden name. And so all of a sudden I thought, wait, what just happened here? Okay. So then I went back and searched, and sure enough, there was a death record for this Mary in between these 2 censuses. So I've got 2 women with the same name married to this man. Now, I don't know what this Mary's middle name is. I could make some assumptions, but I'm not going to because I have no record that states her middle name. So I just listed her as Mary E. and then her maiden name. This Mary, I have found a record, actually 2 of her children's birth records that list her name as Mary Elizabeth. And so I know that this woman is all the same person. Okay. Now, why is her birth or her age wildly different? Well, I have a suspicion. I have found some records, in particular her death record, that leads me to believe that February of 1864 was her actual birth date. Okay, so it's kind of right in between these two. This one, I also have a sneaking suspicion that maybe she just didn't want to be 50. Or maybe somebody else gave the census taker the information and didn't want to call her older than 50, or who knows, right? This is an outlier and anomaly that's easily explained by the fact that we don't know what the census taker, who gave the census taker the information. This Mary was actually born in Pennsylvania. Remember, I said they moved in between the 1910 and 1920 censuses. And so I have a suspicion that instead of asking were you born, the census taker asked where are you from, and the response was that they were all from Ohio rather than that she was born in Pennsylvania. So not only have I resolved the conflicting evidence by collecting more evidence and determining what is accurate and what is inaccurate, but I also in the process discovered that these were two different people, got two different relationships. So hopefully that was really quick. You might need to watch that again to catch all of that, but that is the process that I go through. I create tables and charts and spreadsheets all the time to help sort through some of this stuff. Not all conflicting evidence can be resolved. You need to recognize that, and if you haven't resolved it, your conclusion hasn't been proven, and so that just might mean you have to set it aside for a little while, or you have to take a pause, or you have to come back and do more research, or whatever. And so create notes to that effect. My notes simply come in here, and I just put information that I need. Here's what I think is going on, but that I need to verify that so that I know I have further research that needs to be done. And so I put that straight into my notes, because invariably I'm going to get pulled away off onto a different family, and I'm going to come back and need to know exactly why I entered something the way I entered it, why I came to the conclusion or the temporary conclusion that I've come to, knowing that further research needs to be done before I can say I have proven this sufficiently, both for my satisfaction and to meet the genealogical proof standard. Well, that is all I have for you today. We ran a little bit long, but there was a lot of good information in there and a lot of good reminders, even to myself, that I need to be a little bit more careful about looking at that conflicting evidence and making sure that I resolve all of it before I come to my conclusions. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.